My daddy designed that engine." The whole room stopped breathing. 40 engineers. Not one of them had an answer. But a 7-year-old girl in a faded blue dress walked straight through the crowd, looked the CEO dead in the eye, and pointed at the mechanic standing in the back corner with grease still on his hands. Victoria Lauren turned. She stared at the man. A mechanic. $22 an hour. And the engine sitting behind her was worth $300 million. Nobody in that room was ready for what came next. And honestly, neither was he. Comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story reaches. Subscribe and follow this channel now, because this story is just getting started. Daniel Hayes heard the alarm go off at 4:30 in the morning, same as every other day. He didn't hit snooze. He never hit snooze. He reached over, killed the sound, and sat on the edge of his bed for exactly 10 seconds. That was all the time he allowed himself before his feet hit the cold floor. Emma was still sleeping. He could hear her breathing through the thin wall that separated their bedrooms. Soft, steady, the kind of breathing that told him she was deep in a dream. He hoped it was a good one. He walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and pulled out the bread. 2 slices for her. Peanut butter on one, grape jelly on the other. He pressed them together, cut the sandwich diagonal because that's how she liked it, and slid it into a paper bag. He dropped in an apple, a juice box, and a napkin. On the napkin, he wrote the same thing he wrote every single day. "You are my sunshine. Love, Dad." He set the bag on the counter and poured himself a cup of leftover coffee from the night before. He didn't bother heating it up. Cold coffee still had caffeine, and caffeine was all he needed. By 5:15 he was dressed. Steel-toed boots, dark pants, a gray shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. He grabbed his jacket and his keys and walked to Emma's door. He pushed it open just enough to see her face. She was curled up on her side, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost one ear 2 years ago. "I'll see you tonight, baby girl," he whispered. He pulled the door shut and left. The drive to the factory took 22 minutes when there was no traffic, and at 5 in the morning, there was never traffic. Daniel parked in the same spot he always parked in, row C, space 14. He walked through the side entrance, clocked in, and headed straight for the maintenance bay. The factory belonged to Lauron Industrial Technologies, one of the biggest engine manufacturing companies on the East Coast. It employed over 3,000 people, and Daniel Hayes was one of them. Not an engineer, not a designer, not a project lead, a mechanic. Employee number 7419. The man who kept the machines running so the real engineers could do their jobs. And Daniel was fine with that. At least, that's what he told himself. He grabbed his toolbox and walked to line 4, where a stamping press had been acting up for the past week. The hydraulics were sluggish, and the timing was off by just enough to slow production. 2 engineers had looked at it on Monday. They'd written up a report, recommended replacing the entire hydraulic assembly, and estimated a cost of $47,000. Daniel opened the access panel, looked inside, and found the problem in less than 3 minutes. A worn seal on the secondary pressure valve. A $12 part. He replaced it, ran the press through 3 cycles, and the timing was perfect. He didn't file a report. He didn't tell anyone. He just moved on to the next machine. That was Daniel. Fix it, move on, say nothing. By 7:30, the factory floor was alive. Workers filed in, machines roared to life, and the noise became a constant wall of sound. Daniel stayed in the background, moving from station to station, checking gauges, tightening bolts, replacing filters. Invisible. He'd been invisible for 9 years. He was 26 when he first walked through the doors of Lauron Industrial. He'd just dropped out of the mechanical engineering program at State, 6 credits short of his degree. His wife, Sarah, had just told him she was pregnant. They needed money, not a diploma. So Daniel took the first job he could find, a maintenance position. Temporary, he told himself, just until the baby came and things settled down. The baby came. Things never settled down. Sarah left when Emma was 2. She didn't leave a note. She didn't leave an explanation. She just left. Daniel came home from a double shift and found the apartment half empty. Her clothes were gone. Her phone was disconnected. The only thing she left behind was Emma, asleep in her crib, with no idea that her mother had walked out the door and was never coming back. Daniel didn't fall apart. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But Emma was crying, and she needed a bottle, and the rent was due on Friday. So he picked her up, held her against his chest, and made a decision. He would be enough. He had to be enough. And for 7 years, he was. He worked the early shift so he could pick Emma up from school at 3:15. He cooked dinner every night, even when he was so tired his hands shook. He helped her with homework. He read her stories before bed. He braided her hair on Sunday mornings, and he got better at it over time, though the first few attempts had made them both laugh until they cried. But at night, after Emma was asleep, Daniel did something no one knew about. He sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and a stack of engineering paper, and he designed engines. Not for anyone, not for the company, just for himself. Just to prove that the part of his brain that understood thermodynamics and fuel injection and compression ratios hadn't died when he put on the coveralls and picked up a wrench. It started small. He'd notice a flaw in one of the factory's engine designs during his maintenance rounds. A cooling system that was inefficient. An exhaust manifold that created unnecessary back pressure. A fuel delivery mechanism that wasted energy. He'd go home and sketch out a solution. Then he'd sketch out a better solution. Then he'd redesign the entire system from scratch. Over the years, the sketches turned into full designs. Detailed, precise, brilliant. He filled 17 notebooks. He kept them in a box under his bed, and he never showed them to anyone. Until 6 months ago. It was a Thursday night, and Daniel was working late. Emma was with him, sitting on an overturned crate in the maintenance bay, drawing with her crayons. The factory was quiet. Almost everyone had gone home. Daniel was underneath engine block 14, checking an oil leak, when he heard footsteps. "Hey, Hayes." Daniel rolled out from under the engine and looked up. It was Greg Mercer, one of the senior engineers. Greg was carrying a stack of blueprints and looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What's up, Greg?" Greg dropped the blueprints on Daniel's workbench. "I'm stuck. The Helion project. Victoria wants a prototype in 6 months, and the design isn't working. Fuel efficiency is 15% below target, and I can't figure out why." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and glanced at the blueprints. He saw the problem immediately. The intake manifold geometry was wrong. It was creating turbulence in the airflow, which was choking the combustion cycle. He opened his mouth to say something, then stopped. He was a mechanic. Greg was a senior engineer with a master's degree from MIT. What was Daniel going to say? "Hey, Greg, your manifold geometry is wrong?" That would go over well. "Wish I could help," Daniel said, "but that's above my pay grade." Greg sighed. "Yeah, I know. Just thought maybe you'd seen something like this before. You've been around these engines longer than anyone." Greg picked up the blueprints and walked away. Daniel watched him go. Then Daniel looked at Emma. She was staring at him with those big brown eyes. "Why didn't you help him, Daddy?" Daniel felt something twist in his chest. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "But you know how to fix it. I've seen your drawings." Daniel knelt down in front of her. "Emma, those drawings are just something Daddy does for fun. They're not real." Emma tilted her head. "They look real to me." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and Emma's words kept playing over and over in his head. "They look real to me." He got up at midnight, went to the kitchen, and pulled out his notebooks. He found the one labeled Intake Systems. He flipped to a design he'd been working on for over 2 years, a completely redesigned intake manifold that used a variable geometry system to optimize airflow at every RPM range. It was radical. It was unconventional. And according to every calculation Daniel had run, it would increase fuel efficiency by at least 23%. He stared at the design for a long time. Then he did something he'd never done before. He went back to the factory. It was almost 1 in the morning. The factory was empty, except for the night security guard, who knew Daniel by name and waved him through without a second thought. Daniel walked to the prototype lab, where the unfinished Helion X sat on its platform like a patient on an operating table. He didn't have authorization to be there. He didn't have clearance. He was a mechanic, and this was a restricted engineering area. If anyone found out, he'd be fired. Daniel stood in front of the engine and studied it. He could see every flaw. The intake manifold, just like he'd told himself. But also the cooling system, the exhaust routing, the fuel injector placement. It was like looking at a puzzle that someone had forced together with the wrong pieces. He pulled out his notebook and started making notes, cross-referencing, calculating. By 3 in the morning, he had a complete redesign mapped out. Not just the manifold, the entire engine. He went home, slept for an hour, and got up to make Emma's sandwich. Over the next 3 months, Daniel went back to the factory every night after Emma fell asleep. He hired Mrs. Kessler, the retired teacher who lived next door, to sit in the apartment while Emma slept. He told her he was picking up extra shifts. She never questioned it. Night after night, Daniel worked on the Helion X. He didn't just modify the design. He rebuilt it from the ground up. He machined new parts using the factory's equipment. He recalibrated every system. He tested and retested every component. He poured 7 years of secret engineering knowledge into that engine. And he did it all alone, in the dark, while the rest of the world slept. He knew what he was doing was unauthorized. He knew he could lose his job. He knew that if Victoria Lauren found out, she might not just fire him. She might have him arrested for tampering with company property. But every time the fear crept in, he heard Emma's voice. "They look real to me." So he kept going. 3 months later, the engine was finished. Daniel stood in front of it at 4 in the morning, exhausted, his hands raw, his back aching. But the engine was beautiful. Not beautiful like a painting or a sunset. Beautiful like a solution. Beautiful like something that worked exactly the way it was supposed to work. He ran the diagnostics. Fuel efficiency was 27% above the original target. Emissions were 40% lower than any engine Lauron Industrial had ever produced. Durability projections exceeded industry standards by a factor of 3. Daniel stared at the numbers on the screen and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pride. Then the fear came back. What now? He couldn't tell anyone. He couldn't take credit. He was a mechanic who had broken into a restricted lab and rebuilt a prototype engine without authorization. The best-case scenario was termination. The worst case was prosecution. So he did what he always did. He cleaned up his tools, wiped down his workstation, and walked away. He went home, kissed Emma on the forehead while she slept, and got ready for work. Let someone else take the credit. Let Greg Mercer present it as his own. Let the engineers marvel at the improvements and write papers about their breakthrough. Daniel didn't need recognition. He just needed to know that he could still do it. That the engineer inside him wasn't dead. But that's not what happened. What happened was that Greg Mercer walked into the prototype lab on a Monday morning, looked at the Helion X, and realized that everything had changed. The engine he'd been struggling with for months had been completely redesigned overnight. Or so it seemed. He ran tests. He ran them again. The numbers were staggering. Greg didn't take credit. To his credit, he didn't. He went straight to his boss, Chief Engineer Martin Cole, and said, "Someone rebuilt the Helion X, and whoever did it is a genius." Martin Cole went to see for himself. Then he called his boss. Then his boss called her boss. And that chain of phone calls ended at the desk of Victoria Loron, the CEO of Loron Industrial Technologies. Victoria Loron was not a woman who tolerated mysteries. She was 53 years old, sharp as a razor, and she had built her father's struggling engine company into a $2 billion enterprise through sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than excellence. When Martin Cole told her that someone had secretly rebuilt the Helion X prototype, she didn't ask for a report. She didn't schedule a meeting. She walked straight to the factory floor. That was this morning. And now, here she stood, in front of the Helion X, surrounded by 40 of her top engineers, and she had asked one question. Who designed this engine? The room was silent. 40 engineers looked at each other, then at the floor. Greg Mercer stared at his shoes. Martin Cole adjusted his glasses and said nothing. Nobody knew, or if they knew, they weren't talking. Victoria's patience was running out. "I'm going to ask one more time," she said, "and I want an answer. This engine represents a fundamental leap in design. Someone in this building is responsible. Who is it?" Nothing. Then the door at the back of the room opened, and Emma walked in. She wasn't supposed to be here. Daniel had dropped her at the front desk with Brenda, the receptionist, because school was closed for a teacher workday, and Mrs. Kessler had a doctor's appointment. Brenda was supposed to keep an eye on her. But Emma had gotten restless, and when she heard the announcement over the intercom that all engineering staff should report to the prototype lab, she followed the crowd. Now she stood in the doorway, a small girl in a faded blue dress, clutching a crayon drawing in one hand, and she looked straight at her father. Daniel saw her, and his heart stopped. Not now. Not here. He shook his head slightly, trying to signal her to leave. But Emma didn't leave. She heard the question that was still hanging in the air, and she knew the answer. She had always known the answer. She walked through the crowd of engineers, past Martin Cole, past Greg Mercer, past 3 rows of men and women in pressed shirts and polished shoes, and she stopped in front of Victoria Loron. Victoria looked down at her. "And who are you?" "I'm Emma," she said. "Emma Hayes." "Well, Emma Hayes, this is a restricted area. You shouldn't be here." "I know," Emma said, "but you asked a question, and nobody's answering, so I will." She turned around and pointed straight at Daniel. "My daddy designed that engine." The room went completely still. Every head turned toward Daniel Hayes, the mechanic in the grease-stained coveralls, standing in the back corner with a wrench still in his hand. Victoria looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Emma. Emma looked back at her father with an expression that was pure, absolute, unwavering belief. And Daniel realized, in that moment, that there was nowhere left to hide. Victoria stepped toward him. Her heels clicked against the concrete floor. Click, click, click. Each step felt like a countdown. She stopped directly in front of him and looked him up and down. "You're Daniel Hayes?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're a mechanic?" "Yes, ma'am." My 7-year-old is telling me that you, a mechanic, designed an engine that my entire engineering department couldn't figure out. Is that true?" Daniel looked at Emma. She nodded at him. Just a small nod, like she was giving him permission. He took a breath. "Yes, ma'am, I did." The room erupted. Engineers turned to each other, whispering, some in disbelief, some in outrage. Martin Cole's face turned red. Greg Mercer stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Victoria raised one hand, and the room went silent again. "Prove it," she said. Daniel set down his wrench. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, walked to the engine, and began to talk. He didn't use notes. He didn't use a presentation. He stood in front of the Helion X and explained every modification he'd made, every calculation he'd performed, every design choice and why he'd made it. He talked about the variable geometry intake manifold. He talked about the redesigned cooling channels that used a counterflow system to reduce thermal stress. He talked about the fuel injector placement and how moving them 6 millimeters changed the spray pattern in a way that improved combustion efficiency by 11%. He talked about the exhaust system, the valve timing, the crankshaft balance, the bearing materials. He talked for 20 minutes straight, and nobody interrupted him. Not once. When he finished, the room was silent for a different reason. It wasn't confusion or disbelief anymore. It was respect. The kind of respect that settles over a room when someone has just witnessed something extraordinary. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. "How long have you worked here, Mr. Hayes?" 9 years. "And in those 9 years, did anyone ever know about your engineering background?" "No, ma'am." "Why not?" Daniel paused. He looked at Emma, who was sitting on the floor now, coloring on her drawing, completely unaware that she had just detonated a bomb in the middle of a corporate empire. "Because nobody ever asked," Daniel said. Victoria Loron felt those words hit her like a fist. Because nobody ever asked. 4 words. 4 words that exposed every blind spot, every assumption, every failure of leadership that had allowed a brilliant engineer to hide in plain sight for nearly a decade. She turned to Martin Cole. "Did you know about this?" Martin shook his head. "No, I had no idea." She turned to Greg Mercer. "Greg, you worked with him. You talked to him about the Helion project. Did you ever think to ask if he had ideas?" Greg swallowed hard. "I asked him once. He said it was above his pay grade." Victoria looked back at Daniel. "Above your pay grade?" Daniel said nothing. "Mr. Hayes, the engine you built could generate $300 million in revenue over the next 5 years. It could redefine this company's position in the market. And you called it above your pay grade?" "With respect, ma'am, I make $22 an hour. Everything is above my pay grade." A few people in the room tried not to laugh. Victoria didn't laugh. She stared at Daniel, and something shifted behind her eyes. Something that looked like recognition. Not of his talent. She'd already seen that. Recognition of her own failure. She'd walked past this man 1,000 times. She'd seen him fixing machines, replacing parts, doing the work that kept her factory running. And she had never once stopped to wonder what else he might be capable of. She stepped closer to him and lowered her voice, though everyone in the room could still hear her. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, ma'am." "I owe you 9 years," she said, "and I intend to start making up for it today." She turned to face the room. "As of this moment, Daniel Hayes is no longer a mechanic at Loron Industrial Technologies." Daniel felt his stomach drop. This was it. She was firing him. In front of everyone. in front of Emma. As of this moment, Victoria continued, Daniel Hayes is the lead engineer on the Helion X project. Daniel blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. Ma'am? You heard me. You built it, you lead it. And anyone in this room who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emma looked up from her drawing, smiled at her father, and went back to coloring. Daniel stood there, a wrench still hanging from his belt, grease still under his fingernails, and for the first time in 9 years, he felt like someone had turned on a light in a room he'd been sitting in alone for far too long. He didn't cry. He wanted to, but he didn't. Not here, not in front of all these people. But later that night, after he'd tucked Emma into bed and kissed her forehead and told her he loved her, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and pressed his hands against his face, and the tears came. Not tears of sadness, tears of something he'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. He sat there for a long time, alone in his quiet kitchen, and he let himself feel it. All of it. The years of silence. The years of hiding. The years of being the man who fixed things for other people, while his own dreams rusted in a box under his bed. Emma had pointed at him, and the world had turned. The next morning, Daniel woke up before the alarm. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and for a moment he thought maybe he'd dreamed the whole thing. The prototype lab, Victoria Loron, Emma pointing at him, lead engineer. Maybe none of it was real. Then he saw the business card on his nightstand. White card, embossed letters. Victoria Loron, CEO, Loron Industrial Technologies. On the back, handwritten in blue ink, my office, 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late, Mr. Hayes. It was real. He got up, made Emma's sandwich, wrote the note on the napkin. You are my sunshine. Love, Dad. Same as always. But his hands were shaking, and he had to rewrite the note twice, because the first time his handwriting looked like it belonged to a man having a heart attack. He dropped Emma at school and kissed her on the forehead. She grabbed his sleeve before he could walk away. Daddy? Yeah, baby? Are you scared? Daniel crouched down so he was eye level with her. What makes you think I'm scared? You made my sandwich wrong. You put jelly on both sides. He laughed. It came out rough and tired, but it was real. Yeah, I guess I am a little scared. Emma put her small hand on his cheek. Don't be. You're the smartest person in that whole building. How do you know that? Because I've seen your notebooks, Daddy. All of them. Daniel's smile faded. You've looked at my notebooks? Every single one. At night, when you think I'm sleeping, I sneak into the kitchen and watch you draw. You talk to yourself when you work. Did you know that? He didn't know that. You say things like, if I move this here, and that reduces the pressure by, and then a bunch of numbers. I don't understand the numbers, but I understand that you love it, and you're really, really good at it. Daniel pulled her into a hug and held her tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. Go to work, Daddy, she whispered. Show them who you are. He let go, stood up, and walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a full minute before he turned the key. His daughter had been watching him. For years, she'd been watching him design engines in the middle of the night, and she'd never said a word. She'd just believed in him, quietly, completely, the way only a child can. He drove to the factory. The parking lot felt different. It looked the same. Same cracked asphalt, same rows of cars, same chain-link fence around the perimeter. But Daniel felt like he was walking into a different building. Yesterday, he'd parked in row C, space 14, and walked through the side entrance. Today, he parked in the main lot and walked through the front door, Brenda, the receptionist, looked up when he came in. She stared at him for a second, then said, "Daniel? They told me to send you straight up, 12th floor, executive suite." The 12th floor. That's what they said. Daniel had never been above the 3rd floor. Maintenance was on the ground level. The engineering department was on 3. Everything above that was management, finance, legal, and at the very top, the executive offices. The 12th floor was Victoria Lauron's territory. He took the elevator up. When the doors opened, he stepped into a hallway that was quieter than any place he'd ever been in the building. Thick carpet, glass walls, the smell of expensive coffee. A woman at a desk looked at him and smiled like she'd been expecting him. "Mr. Hayes? Miss Lauron is waiting for you. Go right in." Daniel walked to the door, knocked once, and opened it. Victoria was standing behind her desk, phone pressed to her ear. She held up one finger, telling him to wait. He stood there, hands at his sides, feeling completely out of place. "I don't care what the board thinks," Victoria said into the phone. "The numbers speak for themselves. I'm moving forward with this. End of discussion." She hung up and looked at Daniel. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes." He sat. Victoria didn't sit. She stood behind her desk and studied him the way she'd studied the engine yesterday, like she was looking for flaws. "I did some digging on you last night," she said. "You enrolled in mechanical engineering at State 12 years ago. Top of your class for 3 years. Then you dropped out, 6 credits short of your degree."
"Why?" "My wife was pregnant. I needed a job." "So you came here?" "So I came here." "And you've been fixing machines ever since?" "Yes, ma'am." Victoria sat down and leaned back in her chair. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Hayes. I've run this company for 14 years. I've hired engineers from MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon. I've spent millions on research and development. And in all that time, not one of them has produced anything close to what you built in that prototype lab. Not one." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "But here's my problem," Victoria continued. "You don't have a degree. You don't have credentials. You broke into a restricted lab and modified a prototype without authorization. Technically, I could fire you. Technically, I could press charges." Daniel's chest tightened. "I understand. But I'm not going to do that. Do you know why?" "No, ma'am." "Because firing you would be the stupidest decision I've ever made, and I didn't build a $2 billion company by making stupid decisions." She opened a folder on her desk and slid it across to him. "This is a new employment contract. Lead engineer, Helion X project. Salary, benefits, the works. I want you to read it, sign it, and start today." Daniel opened the folder. He looked at the salary line and his vision blurred. It was more money than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say." "Say yes, and then get to work." Daniel signed the contract. His hand was steady this time. Victoria stood up and walked around the desk. She extended her hand. Daniel shook it. "One more thing," she said. "I'm assigning you a team, 12 engineers. They're going to report to you. Some of them won't like it. Some of them will push back. I need to know you can handle that." "I've been handling pushback my whole life, ma'am." "Good, because it starts in about 10 minutes. Conference room B, 3rd floor. Your team is waiting." Daniel stood up, nodded, and walked to the door. "Mr. Hayes." He stopped and turned. "That little girl of yours. She's something special." "Yes, ma'am, she is." He walked out of the office, took the elevator down to the 3rd floor, and stood outside conference room B. Through the glass wall, he could see 12 people sitting around a long table. Some were talking.
Some were on their laptops. One was laughing at something on his phone. Daniel recognized several of them. Greg Mercer was there. So was Lisa Fan, a structural engineer he'd seen in the prototype lab. And at the far end of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight, sat a man Daniel knew by reputation. Thomas Ridley, senior lead engineer. 20 years with the company, 3 patents to his name. And the man who had been expected to head the Helion X project before Daniel showed up. Daniel pushed open the door and walked in. The room went quiet, not the respectful quiet that had settled over the prototype lab yesterday. A different kind of quiet, the kind that comes before a fight. Daniel walked to the front of the room and stood there. He didn't sit down. He didn't try to smile. He just looked at each person one by one, and then he spoke. I know what you're thinking. Most of you don't know me. The ones who do know me as the guy who fixes the stamping press on line 4. And now I'm standing here telling you I'm leading this project. I get it. I wouldn't trust me either. Nobody said anything. So let me make this simple. I'm not here to impress you. I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here because I built that engine, and I know it better than anyone in this building. If you've got a problem with that, say it now. I'd rather deal with it up front than have it blow up later. Thomas Ridley uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. Fine, I'll say it. I've been with this company for 20 years. I've led 6 major projects. I've got 3 patents and a PhD from Georgia Tech. And you're a mechanic who doesn't even have a bachelor's degree. So, yeah, I've got a problem with it. Daniel looked at him. That's fair. Fair? It's not about fair. It's about qualification. You snuck into a lab in the middle of the night and tinkered with a prototype. That's not engineering. That's sabotage. The engine passed every test Loron Industrial has ever administered. Fuel efficiency is 27% above target. Emissions are 40% lower than anything this company has produced. Those aren't my numbers. Those are the lab's numbers. Verified. Numbers can be manipulated. Then run them again. Run them as many times as you want. I'll stand right here and watch. Thomas leaned back and shook his head. This is a joke. Victoria's lost her mind. Greg Mercer spoke up from the other side of the table. Tom, I saw the engine. I ran the first round of tests myself. Whatever you think about how it happened, the results are real. The design is exceptional. I didn't ask for your opinion, Greg. You didn't have to. I'm giving it anyway. The room tensed. Daniel held up a hand. Listen, I'm not going to stand here and argue about who deserves what. The engine exists. It works. And Victoria wants it developed. That's the job. If you're in, you're in. If you're not, walk out that door and tell Victoria yourself. Nobody moved. Good, Daniel said. Then let's get to work. The first 3 days were brutal. Thomas Ridley challenged every decision Daniel made, every calculation, every specification, every material choice. He questioned Daniel in front of the team. He questioned Daniel in private. And he questioned Daniel in emails that he copied to Martin Cole and 3 members of the board. Daniel didn't flinch. He answered every challenge with data. Not opinions, not feelings. Data. When Thomas questioned the variable geometry manifold, Daniel pulled up the computational fluid dynamics analysis he'd run by hand, showed the pressure differentials at 12 different RPM ranges, and proved that his design reduced turbulence by 31% compared to the conventional approach. When Thomas questioned the cooling system redesign, Daniel walked him through the thermodynamic model step by step and demonstrated that the counterflow configuration reduced peak cylinder temperatures by 18 degrees, which extended the engine's operational lifespan by an estimated 40,000 hours. When Thomas questioned the bearing materials, Daniel handed him a comparative analysis of 7 different alloy compositions, complete with stress test projections and cost breakdowns, all of which he'd calculated at his kitchen table at 2 in the morning. Thomas ran out of questions. He didn't run out of resentment, but he ran out of questions. On the 4th day, something changed. Daniel was at his new workstation, reviewing a tolerance analysis, when Lisa Fan walked up to him. She was quiet, methodical, the kind of engineer who spoke only when she had something worth saying. "I went through your exhaust routing last night," she said. "The secondary bypass valve. I think there's an opportunity to improve the flow rate if we adjust the valve timing by half a degree." Daniel looked at her analysis. She was right. It was a small improvement, maybe 2%, but it was real. "Do it," he said, "and good catch." Lisa nodded and went back to her desk. But Daniel noticed something. She was smiling. Not a big smile, just a small one, the kind that comes when someone feels like their work matters. That was the moment Daniel understood something important. Leading wasn't about proving he was the smartest person in the room. It was about making everyone in the room feel like their ideas could change something. He started doing things differently. Instead of presenting finished solutions, he'd bring problems to the team and ask for input. He'd listen. Really listen. When someone had a good idea, he'd say so publicly. When someone made a mistake, he'd help them fix it privately. Greg Mercer was the first to come around completely. He stayed late one night to help Daniel recalibrate the fuel injection system, and somewhere around midnight, with both of them covered in engine grease and running on bad coffee, Greg said something that caught Daniel off guard. "You know, I asked you about this engine 6 months ago. In the maintenance bay. You told me it was above your pay grade." Daniel kept his eyes on the injector. "I remember." "Why? Why didn't you just tell me you had the answer?" Daniel set down his wrench and looked at Greg. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That no one would take me seriously. That I'd tell you about the manifold and you'd laugh. Or worse, you'd listen, and then someone else would take the credit, and I'd go right back to fixing the stamping press. I couldn't handle that. Not again." Greg was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean, not again?" Daniel rubbed his eyes. He was tired, the kind of tired that lives in your bones. "When I was at State, I had a professor, Dr. Wendell. I submitted a thesis proposal for a new approach to fuel atomization. He told me it was promising. 2 weeks later, he published a paper using my concept. My name wasn't on it." "You're kidding." I went to the department head. He told me I couldn't prove it. I was a student. Wendell was a tenured professor. Who was anyone going to believe? "Is that why you dropped out?" "That's part of it. Sarah being pregnant was the other part. But yeah. After Wendell, I stopped believing that the work would speak for itself. The work doesn't speak. People speak. And people with titles speak louder than people without them." Greg stared at him.
"Daniel, that's messed up."
"Yeah, it is.
"But you still kept designing, all those years."
I couldn't stop. Believe me, I tried. But every time I'd see a flaw in an engine, my brain would start fixing it whether I wanted it to or not. It's like a reflex. I can't turn it off." Greg shook his head slowly.
9 years. You sat on all that brilliance for 9 years.
"I didn't sit on it. I just did it alone."
"Well, you're not alone anymore."
Something passed between them in that moment. Not friendship exactly. Something deeper. The kind of mutual respect that only forms when 2 men drop their defenses and tell the truth. After that, Greg became Daniel's most vocal supporter. He defended Daniel's decisions in meetings. He pushed back against Thomas Ridley's constant undermining. And when other engineers on the team hesitated to bring their ideas to Daniel, Greg told them, "Just talk to him. He's the most brilliant engineer I've ever worked with, and he actually listens."
Which is more than I can say for most of the people on the 12th floor. One by one, the team came around. Sarah Kim, the young materials specialist, approached Daniel with an idea for a new gasket compound that could withstand higher pressures. Daniel tested it, found it viable, and implemented it. When he told Sarah that her contribution would be credited in the project documentation, she nearly cried. James Whitford, the noise and vibration analyst, figured out a way to reduce engine noise by repositioning the harmonic balancer. Daniel gave him full ownership of the modification and told Victoria about it personally. Even Thomas Ridley began to thaw. Not completely. Thomas was too proud for that. But after Daniel solved a critical thermal expansion problem that Thomas had been struggling with for weeks, Thomas walked up to him at the end of the day and said 4 words. That was good work. Coming from Thomas Ridley, that was practically a standing ovation. But the real test was still coming. Victoria had scheduled a formal review of the Helion X in 6 weeks. The board of directors would be there. Investors would be there. The media had already gotten wind of the project, and the story of the mechanic who designed the engine was starting to leak. Victoria wanted a full demonstration, a live test of the engine with real-time data in front of the most powerful people in the industry. 6 weeks. Daniel had 6 weeks to take a prototype that he'd built alone in the middle of the night and turn it into a production-ready engine that could withstand the scrutiny of the entire world. He went home that night and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, drawing on a piece of construction paper. "What are you making?" he asked. "A picture of your engine." He sat down next to her and looked at the drawing. It was a mess of crayon lines, red and blue and black, with gears and bolts and what might have been exhaust pipes shooting out the sides. In the middle, she'd drawn a stick figure with a big smile, standing next to the engine. Above the stick figure, in wobbly letters, she'd written, "My Dad." "That's a pretty good engine," Daniel said. "It's your engine, Daddy, the one you built." "I see that. And who's this guy standing next to it?" "That's you. But I made you smile because you don't smile enough." Daniel looked at his daughter, and he felt something crack open inside his chest. Not pain, something warmer. Something he'd been holding shut for years because he was afraid that if he opened it, he wouldn't be able to close it again. "Come here," he said. She climbed into his lap, and he held her, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then Emma said, "Daddy?" "Yeah?" "Are people being mean to you at work?" He hesitated. "Some people are having a hard time adjusting." "Because you were a mechanic?" "Yeah, because I was a mechanic." "That's dumb," he laughed. "Yeah, Emma, it is. You should tell them what you tell me." "What's that?" "That it doesn't matter where you start. It matters where you finish." Daniel closed his eyes and pressed his face into her hair. She smelled like crayons and apple juice and everything good in the world. "When did you get so smart?" he asked. "I learned it from you." That night, after Emma was asleep, Daniel didn't sit at the kitchen table and draw. He didn't pull out his notebooks. He sat in the dark living room and thought about the next 6 weeks. The demonstration, the board, the investors, Thomas Ridley, the media, all of it pressing down on him like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. But then he thought about Emma's drawing, the stick figure with the big smile. My dad. He stood up, went to the kitchen, and started working. The first week nearly broke him. Daniel worked 18-hour days. He left the house before Emma woke up and came home after she was asleep. Mrs. Kessler picked her up from school, made her dinner, helped her with homework, and put her to bed.
Daniel would come in after midnight, check on Emma, stand in her doorway for a minute, watching her breathe, and then go to the kitchen table and keep working. He hated it. He hated every second of being away from her. But the demonstration was in 5 weeks, and the Helion X wasn't ready. The prototype worked. The numbers were solid. But turning a hand-built prototype into something that could survive a live demonstration in front of the board of directors and a room full of investors was a different thing entirely. Every component needed to be stress-tested. Every system needed redundancy. Every possible failure point needed a backup plan. And Daniel had to do all of this while managing a team of 12 engineers, half of whom still weren't sure he belonged in the room. On Tuesday of the first week, the fuel injection system failed during a stress test. Not catastrophically. A hairline fracture in the secondary fuel rail that caused a pressure drop of 4%. Small enough to miss on a standard diagnostic. Big enough to kill the engine during a live demonstration. Daniel found the fracture at 11 at night. He was alone in the lab. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. He pulled the fuel rail, examined it under magnification, and saw the problem. The alloy they'd used was rated for the correct pressure, but the harmonic vibration at peak RPM created a resonance frequency that the alloy couldn't handle over time. He needed a different material, something with the same tensile strength, but better fatigue resistance at high frequencies. He sat down, pulled out a sheet of paper, and started calculating. At 2 a.m, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Kessler.
Daniel, I'm sorry to bother you so late. Emma woke up crying. She had a nightmare. She's asking for you.
Daniel closed his eyes. Put her on. He heard rustling, then Emma's voice, small and shaky.
Daddy?
I'm here, baby. I'm right here.
I had a bad dream. You were gone. You left and you didn't come back.
Daniel gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. I'm not going anywhere, Emma. I promise you. I will always come back.
When are you coming home?
Soon. Real soon.
You always say soon.
He could hear her crying, and it cut through him worse than anything Thomas Ridley or any board of directors could ever do. Listen to me, Emma. I need you to do something for me. Can you go to my room and look under the bed? There's a box there. A blue box. He heard her footsteps, then some shuffling.
I found it.
Open it. There should be a notebook on top with a red cover.
I see it.
Open the notebook to the first page. What do you see? A pause. It's a drawing. It's me. You drew me, Daddy. I drew that the night you were born. You were so small. And I made you a promise that night. I promised that everything I did from that day forward would be for you. Every single thing. That's why I'm here right now, sweetheart. Not because I want to be away from you. Because I'm building something for us. For our future. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Okay, Daddy. Go back to bed. I'll be there when you wake up. Promise? Promise. He hung up, set the phone down, and stared at the fuel rail on the table in front of him. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to work. He was home by 5:30. He climbed into Emma's bed and she curled up against him without waking. He set the alarm for 6:15 and let himself sleep for 45 minutes with his daughter pressed against his chest. When the alarm went off, he made her sandwich. Peanut butter on one side, grape jelly on the other. Diagonal cut. Napkin note. You are my sunshine. Love, Dad. He drove to the factory with a solution for the fuel rail, in his head and dark circles under his eyes that could have scared small children. By 9 o'clock, he was in the lab, presenting his findings to the team. The secondary fuel rail needs to be replaced. The current alloy can't handle the resonance frequency at peak RPM. I've identified an alternative. titanium stabilized austenitic steel, higher fatigue resistance, comparable tensile strength, and it's available from our existing supplier. Lisa Fan looked at the calculations. The cost increase is marginal, maybe 6% on that component? 6% on one component to prevent a catastrophic failure during the live demo, Daniel said. I'll take that trade. Greg nodded. I'll call the supplier today. Thomas Ridley, who had been sitting silently at the end of the table, spoke up.
You found this at 11 at night? Alone? I found it when I found it, Daniel said. Does it matter what time it was? It matters because the rest of us should have caught it during normal testing hours. We ran the stress test 3 times. Nobody flagged the pressure drop. Daniel looked at him carefully. Thomas wasn't attacking. His tone was different. Frustrated, yes, but directed inward. Directed at himself. The pressure drop was 4%, Daniel said, within standard tolerance. The standard test wouldn't flag it. But the standard test doesn't account for harmonic resonance at sustained peak RPM. That's a gap in the testing protocol, not a failure by anyone on this team. Thomas stared at him. So you're saying our testing protocol is inadequate? I'm saying it needs to be updated, and I'd like you to lead that effort. The room went still. Daniel was giving Thomas Ridley, the man who had challenged him at every turn, ownership of a critical component of the project. Thomas didn't respond right away. He looked at Daniel for a long time, reading him, trying to figure out if this was a power play or a genuine offer. Whatever he saw in Daniel's face must have convinced him. Fine, Thomas said. I'll have a revised protocol by end of week. Thank you. Thomas nodded once. It wasn't warmth, but it was the first time Thomas Ridley had agreed to something Daniel proposed without fighting at first. The second week brought a different kind of problem. Daniel was in his office, reviewing the latest vibration analysis, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it and read the message 3 times. Daniel, it's Sarah. I know this is out of nowhere. I heard about what happened at Loron. I saw the article. I'd like to talk. Can we meet? Sarah, his ex-wife, Emma's mother, the woman who had walked out of their apartment 5 years ago and never looked back. Daniel set the phone down on his desk and stared at it like it was a live grenade. The article. He knew the one she meant. A tech journalist had gotten hold of the story about the mechanic at Loron Industrial who'd secretly redesigned the Helion X. It had run online 2 days ago, and it was getting traction. Someone at the factory had talked, and now the internet was doing what the internet does. The story was everywhere. Daniel hadn't read the article. He didn't want to, but apparently Sarah had. He picked up the phone and typed, "Why?" The response came in seconds. "I want to see Emma." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not anger exactly. Something older. Something that had been sitting at the bottom of his chest for 5 years, covered in scar tissue, buried under work and fatherhood and survival. He didn't respond. He put the phone in his desk drawer, closed the drawer, and went back to the vibration analysis. But he couldn't focus. The numbers blurred. The equations wouldn't hold. Sarah's name kept flashing in his mind like a warning light he couldn't shut off. At lunch, Greg found him sitting alone in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "You okay?" Greg asked. "Fine." "You don't look fine. You look like someone just told you the engine exploded." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "My ex-wife texted me." Greg sat down across from him. "The one who left?" "That's the one." "What does she want?" "She wants to see Emma." Greg let out a low whistle. "After 5 years? What brought that on?" "The article. She saw the article." Greg leaned back.
So she ignored you for 5 years, and now that you're in the news, she shows up. That's convenient. Yeah. What are you going to do? I don't know.
Does Emma ever ask about her? Daniel's jaw tightened. Sometimes. Not as much as she used to. When she was little, she'd ask every day, "Where's Mommy? When is Mommy coming home?" I'd tell her Mommy had to go away for a while. After about a year, she stopped asking. She just stopped. That's heartbreaking. It is what it is. Daniel, you don't have to respond to her. You know that, right? She left. She made that choice. You don't owe her anything. I know, but Emma might want to see her. And if I keep that from her, what does that make me? Greg didn't have an answer for that. That night, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed with the phone in his hand. He read Sarah's message again. I want to see Emma. 4 words that had the power to disrupt everything he'd built. Not the engine, not the project. The life. The careful, fragile, beautiful life he'd constructed around his daughter. He thought about calling his mother. But his mother was in Arizona, and she'd never liked Sarah, and the conversation would turn into a lecture. He thought about calling a lawyer, but a lawyer felt aggressive, and he didn't even know what Sarah actually wanted. So he did the thing he always did when he didn't know what to do. He went to Emma's room. She was asleep, one arm thrown over her stuffed rabbit, her hair fanned out across the pillow. He sat on the floor next to her bed and watched her. This girl had been his anchor for 5 years. When everything else fell apart, when the loneliness got so bad he couldn't breathe, when he doubted every decision he'd ever made, Emma was the constant. She was the reason he got up at 4:30 every morning. She was the reason he packed the lunch and wrote the napkin note and worked the double shifts and kept the notebooks under the bed. She was the reason he'd built the engine. He was not going to let Sarah walk back in and blow it all up. Not now. Not when things were finally starting to change. He went back to his room, picked up the phone, and typed, "Not now. We're in the middle of something. I'll reach out when the time is right." Sarah's response came 20 minutes later. "You can't keep her from me forever, Daniel." He turned off the phone and set it on the nightstand, screen down. The 3rd week was when the engine really came together. Thomas Ridley delivered the revised testing protocol, and it was thorough, brutally thorough. 14 new test parameters, each designed to catch the kind of hidden failures that standard protocols missed. Daniel read through it twice and told Thomas it was the best testing framework he'd ever seen. Thomas didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped half an inch, which for Thomas Ridley was practically an emotional breakdown. They ran the Helion X through every test on the new protocol. It passed all 14. Not just passed, dominated. The numbers were so good that Lisa Fan double-checked her instruments 3 times because she thought they had to be malfunctioning. "They're not malfunctioning," Daniel told her. "The engine is just that good." "Daniel, the thermal efficiency is at 53%. The industry standard is 42. This doesn't just exceed expectations, it rewrites them." "Then let's make sure we can prove it in front of the board." The team was working together now. Not perfectly. There were still disagreements, still moments of friction. James Whitford and Sarah Kim got into a heated argument about the harmonic balancer repositioning that ended with James storming out of the lab and Sarah throwing a wrench at a wall. Daniel called them both into his office separately, listened to both sides, and found a compromise that incorporated elements of both approaches. By the end of the day, James and Sarah were running joint simulations and arguing about where to order dinner. Daniel watched his team and felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride in the engine, pride in the people. These 12 engineers had gone from skeptics to believers, and they'd done it because Daniel had given them something rare. He'd given them ownership.
He'd made each person feel like the project couldn't succeed without their specific contribution. Because it couldn't. On Friday of the third week, Victoria called Daniel to her office. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "The board meeting is in 3 weeks. I've been fielding calls from investors all week. The article generated a lot of attention. Most of it positive, some of it not." "What kind of not?" Victoria picked up a printed email from her desk. "This is from Richard Carr. He's our largest institutional investor. He controls 17% of the company's shares."
What does he say? He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he has serious concerns about a multi-million-dollar project being led by someone without formal engineering credentials. He's questioning whether the company is taking unnecessary risks by putting an unqualified individual in a leadership position. Daniel felt the words land like punches. Unqualified. There it was again. The same word that had followed him his entire career. The same word that Dr. Wendell had used when Daniel tried to claim credit for his own work. The same word the world used to keep people in their place. "What do you think?" Daniel asked. "I think Richard Carr is a man who spent 40 years valuing paper over performance. I think he's never built anything with his own hands in his life. And I think when he sees that engine run in 3 weeks, he's going to shut his mouth and write us a very large check." "And if he doesn't?" Victoria leaned forward. "Daniel, I'm going to be honest with you. If the demonstration fails, it's not just the project that's finished. It's both of us. The board will use it as an excuse to replace me with someone more conservative, and they'll bury the Helion X along with your career. Richard Carr is already building a coalition. He's got 3 other board members leaning his way. So the demonstration isn't just about the engine. It's about everything. The engine, your future, my leadership, the direction of this entire company. No pressure." Daniel almost laughed. Almost. "I'll make sure the engine is ready." "I know you will. But I need more than a working engine. I need a flawless presentation. I need data that's airtight. I need a live test that leaves no room for doubt. Can you give me that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Because I'm betting my career on you, Mr. Hayes. And I don't make bets I intend to lose." Daniel left her office and took the stairs instead of the elevator. He needed to move. He needed to think. 12 flights of stairs, and by the time he reached the ground floor, he had a plan. He called a team meeting for 6 o'clock that evening. Everyone showed up. Even Thomas Ridley, who usually left at 5 sharp. Daniel stood in front of them and didn't sugarcoat it. "The demonstration is in 3 weeks. The board is skeptical. At least one major investor is actively trying to kill this project. If we fail, it's over. Not just for the Helion X, for all of us. Victoria is on the line. I'm on the line. And everyone in this room is on the line. Because if this project goes down, it takes the entire Advanced Development Division with it." The room was dead silent. "So here's what we're going to do. We're going to run every test on Thomas's protocol one more time. We're going to identify every possible failure point, no matter how small, and we're going to eliminate it. We're going to prepare a presentation that doesn't just show the numbers, but makes those numbers undeniable. And when we walk into that boardroom in 3 weeks, there will not be a single question we can't answer, a single doubt we can't address, and a single person in that room who walks out unconvinced." Greg spoke first. "I'm in." Lisa nodded. "Whatever it takes." James Whitford cracked his knuckles. "Let's do it." One by one, they all committed. Thomas Ridley was last. He looked at Daniel for a long moment, and then he said something that no one in the room expected. "You know, Hayes,
When Victoria put you in charge, I thought she'd lost her mind. I spent the first 2 weeks trying to prove you didn't belong here. I filed complaints. I went to Martin Cole. I even called Richard Carr's office. The room tensed. Daniel felt a flash of heat behind his eyes, but kept his face neutral. I was wrong, Thomas continued. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about this engine.
You're the best engineer I've ever worked with, and the fact that you don't have a piece of paper from some university doesn't change that. So whatever you need from me for the next 3 weeks, you've got it.
Daniel stared at him. Of all the things he'd expected from Thomas Ridley, an apology wasn't one of them. Thank you, Thomas. That means more than you know. Don't get sentimental on me, Hayes. We've got work to do. The room exhaled. A few people laughed. The tension broke, and in its place was something stronger. Unity. 12 people, all pulling in the same direction, for the first time since the project started. Daniel drove home that night feeling something unfamiliar. Not hope. He'd felt hope before. This was different. This was momentum. The feeling that things were moving in the right direction and picking up speed. He walked in the door and found Emma sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Kessler, working on a school project.
A poster board covered in photographs and drawings.
"What's this?" Daniel asked. "It's for school. We have to make a poster about our hero." Daniel looked at the poster. In the center, Emma had glued a photograph. It was a picture of Daniel, taken last Christmas, sitting on the floor with Emma in his lap. They were both laughing. He didn't even remember the picture being taken. Above the photograph, in big, careful letters, Emma had written, "My hero, my dad." Below it, she'd written a paragraph in her best handwriting. "My dad is an engineer. He designs the engine that will change the world. He works very hard, and he always makes me feel safe. He is the bravest person I know because he never gives up, even when things are hard." She'd misspelled designed and engine, but Daniel didn't care about that. He cared about the word she'd used at the end. Brave. She thought he was brave. He knelt down next to her and pointed at the poster. "This is beautiful, Emma.
Do you like it?" "I love it. Mrs. Patterson said we have to present it to the whole class on Monday. I'm a little nervous." Daniel put his arm around her. "You want to know a secret? I have to give a big presentation too, to a whole room full of people. And I'm a little nervous too." Emma looked at him with those big brown eyes. "Then we'll both be brave on Monday." "Deal." She stuck out her pinky, and they locked pinkies. And Daniel held on a little longer than usual. Mrs. Kessler watched from the doorway and quietly wiped her eyes. Later that night, after Emma was in bed, Daniel pulled out his phone and looked at Sarah's last message again. "You can't keep her from me forever, Daniel." He read it 3 times. Then he opened a new message and typed, "You're right, I can't. But right now my focus is on Emma and on my work. If you're serious about being in her life, it has to be on her terms, not yours. I'll be in touch after the demonstration." He hit send before he could talk himself out of it. Sarah didn't respond. Daniel put the phone away, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened his notebook. 3 weeks. 21 days to build something that couldn't fail. 21 days to prove that a mechanic from the maintenance bay could stand in front of the most powerful people in the industry and show them what he was made of. He picked up his pencil and got to work. 21 days turned into 14. 14 turned into 7. And with 7 days left before the demonstration, Daniel's phone rang at 6 in the morning. He was already awake. He was always awake. He grabbed the phone off the nightstand and saw Victoria Laurent's name on the screen. "Mr. Hayes."
Ma'am? Richard Carr just called an emergency board session for this Friday, 2 days before the demonstration. He's pushing a vote to cancel the Helion X project and remove me as CEO. Daniel sat up straight.
Can he do that? He has 17% of the shares and 3 board members in his pocket. If he flips one more, he has enough votes to force a leadership review. And if that happens, the demonstration is dead. The project is dead. Everything we've worked for is done. Who's the swing vote? Margaret Chen. She's been neutral so far. But Richard's been working on her for weeks. He's flying in from New York tomorrow to meet with her personally. What do you need from me? I need you in that boardroom on Friday. Not as an engineer, as the face of this project. Richard Carr has never met you. He's made his judgments based on a news article and a resume that says you're a mechanic. I need him to sit across from you and understand exactly who he's trying to shut down. I'm not a salesman, Victoria. I'm not asking you to sell anything. I'm asking you to show up and be who you are. That's been enough to convince everyone else. Daniel was quiet for a moment. What time Friday? 10 o'clock, 12th floor. Wear a suit. I don't own a suit. Then buy one, today. I'll have my assistant send you the name of a tailor. And Daniel? Yeah? Don't shave. Don't try to look like something you're not. Just show up as the man who built that engine. That's all I need. She hung up. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, phone in his hand, and felt the pressure double. He got up, made Emma's sandwich, drove her to school, and went straight to the factory. He called a team meeting at 8 o'clock and told them everything. The board is meeting Friday. There's a vote to cancel the project. If it passes, the demonstration on Sunday doesn't happen. None of this happens. The room erupted. Greg slammed his hand on the table. Lisa stood up from her chair. James started swearing under his breath. Thomas Ridley didn't move, but his face went white. Calm down, Daniel said. All of you, listen to me. We've spent weeks preparing for Sunday. Now we've got a new deadline, Friday. I need the engine data compiled into a presentation that can stop this vote. I need performance metrics, efficiency comparisons, projected revenue impact, everything. And I need it by Thursday night. Thomas spoke first. I can have the performance data ready by tomorrow. Good. Lisa raised her hand. I'll handle the efficiency comparisons, industry benchmarks, competitor analysis, projected cost savings. Do it. Greg leaned forward. What about the revenue projections? That's the language these board members speak. They don't care about thermal efficiency. They care about money. I know. And that's why I need you to work with finance on this. Get real numbers, not estimates, not projections based on projections. Hard data. What does this engine mean in dollars? I'll have it Thursday. Daniel looked around the room. Listen, I know this isn't what any of you signed up for. You're engineers, not politicians. But the reality is that the best engine in the world doesn't matter if it never sees production. Richard Carr wants to kill this project because it's easier to say no than to bet on something new. We have 2 days to make saying no impossible. The team scattered. For the next 48 hours, the lab operated like a war room. Daniel barely slept. He reviewed every data point, rehearsed every argument, anticipated every objection Richard Carr might raise. On Wednesday night, he went to the tailor Victoria's assistant had recommended, a small shop downtown run by an old man named Frank, who took one look at Daniel and said, "You've never worn a suit before, have you?" That obvious? Your shoulders are tense just being in this shop. Relax. A suit doesn't change who you are. It just makes other people pay attention. Frank measured him, picked out a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt, and a dark blue tie. Daniel looked at himself in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. He looked like an engineer. He looked like someone who belonged in a boardroom.
Stop frowning, Frank said. You look like you're going to a funeral. Feels like I might be. Frank adjusted the collar and stepped back. Let me tell you something. I've been fitting suits for 40 years. I've dressed CEOs, senators, generals, and the ones who wear the suit the best are always the ones who didn't start in one, because they know what it cost them to get here. Daniel paid for the suit, hung it in his truck, and drove to the factory for one last review of the presentation. Thursday night, the team gathered in Conference Room B for a final run-through. Daniel stood at the front and went through the presentation slide by slide. When he finished, he looked at his team. Honest feedback. What's missing? Thomas spoke up. The emotional argument. What do you mean? Carr doesn't care about data.
If he did, he'd have looked at the numbers already and shut up. He cares about control. He cares about being right. You're not just fighting a business objection, Daniel. You're fighting a man's ego, and you can't beat ego with spreadsheets. So what do I do? Thomas leaned back in his chair. You tell your story. You stand in front of that board and you tell them who you are. Not the data, not the metrics. You. The mechanic who built an engine that none of their expensive engineers could build. Make it personal. Make them feel it. Greg nodded. Tom's right. The numbers prove the engine works, but the story is what makes it impossible to say no. Daniel looked at the floor. He'd spent his whole life avoiding attention, hiding, staying invisible. And now they were asking him to stand in front of a room of the most powerful people in the industry and bare his soul. I'll think about it, he said. He went home and found Emma still awake, waiting for him on the couch with her stuffed rabbit. You should be in bed, he said. I know, but I wanted to see you. You've been gone a lot. He sat down next to her, and she immediately climbed into his lap. He held her and breathed in the smell of her shampoo. Strawberries. She always smelled like strawberries. Daddy, are you okay? I'm okay, baby. You don't seem okay. You seem worried. He kissed the top of her head. I have a big meeting tomorrow. Some people want to take away the engine project. Emma pulled back and looked at him. Why? Because they don't believe a mechanic can build something great. But you did build something great. I know, but sometimes believing isn't enough. Sometimes you have to convince other people to believe too. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Remember when I had to present my hero poster in class? Yeah. I was really scared. But Mrs. Patterson told me something. She said the best way to make people believe you is to tell the truth, because the truth sounds different than everything else. Daniel stared at his daughter. 7 years old, and she kept handing him wisdom like it was nothing. When did you get so smart? He asked. It was the same thing he always asked her, and she gave the same answer she always gave. I learned it from you. He put her to bed, read her a story, and sat in the dark living room for a long time. Then he pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. Not calculations this time, not engineering specs. Words. His words. His story. He wrote about dropping out of school, about Sarah leaving, about raising Emma alone, about the notebooks under the bed and the midnight sessions in the restricted lab. He wrote about being invisible for 9 years and what that does to a person. He wrote about Emma pointing at him in front of Victoria Loron and 40 engineers and saying, My daddy designed that engine. He wrote for 2 hours straight, crossed out half of it, rewrote it, crossed it out again, and finally ended up with 1 page. 1 page that said everything. He folded it, put it in the breast pocket of his new suit, and went to bed. Friday morning, 10 o'clock, 12th floor.
Daniel stepped out of the elevator in his charcoal suit and white shirt. Greg was waiting for him in the hallway. He looked Daniel up and down. "Well, look at you. Don't start. I'm just saying, you clean up nice." Greg, all right. Victoria's already inside. Carr's been here since 9. He brought his lawyer. Of course he did. Margaret Chen's in there too. She hasn't said a word to anyone. Just sitting there with her reading glasses on, going through documents. That's either very good or very bad. Yep. Daniel took a breath and walked through the doors. The boardroom was full. Victoria sat at one end of the long table. Richard Carr sat at the other. Between them, 8 board members, 2 lawyers, and Martin Cole. Daniel counted 14 people in the room, and every single one of them turned to look at him when he walked in. Richard Carr was exactly what Daniel had expected. Mid-60s, silver hair, expensive watch, the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of being the most important person in every room. He looked at Daniel the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. "So this is the mechanic," Carr said. Not to Daniel, to the room. Victoria stood. "This is Daniel Hayes, lead engineer on the Helion X project. And I'd appreciate it if you addressed him directly, Richard." "I'll address him however I see fit, Victoria. This is a board meeting, not a pep rally." Carr turned to Daniel. "Mr. Hayes, I've reviewed your file. No degree, no engineering certifications, 9 years in maintenance. Can you explain to me why this company should entrust a $300 million project to someone with your background?" Daniel felt every eye in the room on him. He could feel the folded piece of paper in his breast pocket, pressing against his chest. "Mr. Carr, I could show you the performance data on the Helion X. I could show you that it exceeds every benchmark your company has ever set. I could show you projected revenue figures that would make your 17% of this company worth a lot more than it is today. And I will show you all of that. But first, I want to answer your question. Your real question, which isn't about my background. It's about whether you can trust someone who doesn't look like what you think an engineer should look like." Carr's expression didn't change. "Go on." 12 years ago, I was at the top of my class in mechanical engineering. I had a professor who stole my work and published it under his name. I went to the department. They told me I couldn't prove it. I was a student. He was tenured. Nobody believed me. A few months later, my wife got pregnant and I needed a job. So I came here. And for 9 years, I fixed your machines. I kept your production lines running. I replaced parts, recalibrated systems, and solved problems that your engineers couldn't solve because they never bothered to look at the maintenance bay. He paused. The room was dead silent. And every night, after I put my daughter to bed, I sat at my kitchen table, and I designed engines. Not for money, not for credit. Because I couldn't stop. Because the part of me that understands how these machines work doesn't care about titles or degrees or what anyone thinks I should be. That part of me just solves problems. And 6 months ago, that part of me looked at the Helion X prototype and saw every flaw in the design. So I fixed it. I rebuilt it from the ground up, alone, in the middle of the night. And the engine I built is the best engine this company has ever produced. Carr leaned forward slightly. "That's a nice story, but stories don't generate revenue." "You're right. Numbers do." Daniel turned to Victoria. "May I?" Victoria nodded. Daniel walked to the screen at the front of the room and pulled up the presentation. For the next 40 minutes, he walked the board through every aspect of the Helion X. Performance data, efficiency metrics, durability projections, cost analysis, revenue forecasts. He didn't use notes, he didn't stumble. He spoke the way he spoke about everything he cared about, with clarity and conviction, and the quiet authority of a man who knows exactly what he's talking about. Greg's revenue projections hit the room like a bomb. $312 million in projected revenue over 5 years. A 37% reduction in production costs compared to the current engine line. Potential licensing deals with another $150 million. Lease's efficiency comparisons showed the Helion X outperforming every competitor on the market by a minimum of 20%. Thomas's reliability data proved the engine could outlast the industry standard by a factor of 3. When Daniel finished, he turned off the screen and faced the room. "Mr. Carr, you asked me why this company should trust me. Here's my answer. Don't trust me. Trust the engine. Trust the data. Trust the fact that every test, every metric, every projection tells you the same thing. The Helion X works. It doesn't care who built it. It doesn't care that I used to be a mechanic. It works because the engineering is sound. And if you vote to kill this project today, you won't be punishing me. You'll be punishing this company. You'll be walking away from $300 million because the man who built the engine doesn't fit your idea of what an engineer should look like." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, looked at it one last time, then set it on the table. "My daughter made a poster for school last week. The assignment was to write about their hero. She wrote about me. She said I was the bravest person she knows, because I never give up, even when things are hard. She misspelled designed and engine. She's 7. But she got the important part right. I don't give up. I never have, and I'm not going to start now. Not because of a vote, not because of politics, not because someone in this room thinks a mechanic can't change the world." He stepped back from the table. "That's all I have." The room was still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret Chen, the swing vote, took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. She looked at Richard Carr. Then she looked at Daniel. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "I've sat on 12 corporate boards in my career. I've heard hundreds of presentations. I've voted on billions of dollars worth of projects." She paused. That was the most compelling argument I have ever heard in a boardroom. Not because of the numbers, although the numbers are extraordinary, because of the conviction. You didn't come in here trying to convince us. You came in here telling the truth. And in my experience, the truth is the only thing that's ever worth investing in. She turned to Carr. "I'm voting to continue the Helion X project. And I'm voting to affirm Victoria's leadership. I suggest you do the same, Richard." Carr's jaw tightened. He looked around the table, counting votes, doing the math. Whatever number he arrived at, he didn't like it. His coalition had crumbled. Margaret Chen's vote had tipped the balance, and 3 of the board members who had been on the fence were now nodding. "This isn't over," Carr said quietly. "Actually, Richard, it is," Victoria replied. "Shall we take the vote?" The vote was 8-4. The Helion X project would continue. Victoria's leadership was affirmed. The demonstration on Sunday would go forward as planned. Daniel walked out of the boardroom and made it to the hallway before his legs started shaking. He leaned against the wall and pressed his hands to his face. Greg came out a moment later and stood next to him. "You okay?" "I think I'm going to throw up." "That's normal. You just stared down a billionaire in front of the entire board and won. Your body's going to have some feelings about that." "Greg." "Yeah?" "Thank you. For the revenue numbers, for backing me up, for all of it." Greg put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't thank me. You did this. All I did was put together some spreadsheets." Those spreadsheets just saved the project. No, Daniel, you saved the project. The moment you started talking about Emma, about the notebooks, about sitting at your kitchen table at 2 in the morning, I watched Margaret Chen's face change. She wasn't looking at numbers anymore. She was looking at you. And she saw what the rest of us have seen for weeks. A man who deserves to be here. Daniel pushed off the wall and straightened his tie. Sunday, the demonstration. That's what matters now. Sunday, Greg agreed. Let's finish this. Daniel drove home that afternoon. He picked Emma up from school, and she climbed into the truck with her backpack and her lunchbox and a huge smile on her face. How was your day, Daddy? It was a good day, baby. A really good day. Did you wear the suit? I wore the suit. Did you look handsome? Frank the tailor seemed to think so. Who's Frank the tailor? A very wise man. Emma giggled. Daddy, you're being weird. Yeah, I probably am. They drove home in comfortable silence, and Daniel felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly. Something deeper. The knowledge that he'd stood in a room full of people who had the power to destroy everything he'd built, and he hadn't buckled. He hadn't hidden. He hadn't pretended to be something he wasn't. He'd told the truth. Just like Emma said, the truth sounds different than everything else. 2 more days. Sunday was coming, and Daniel was ready. That night, after Emma was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table one last time. Not to work, not to calculate, just to sit. He looked at the stack of notebooks piled beside him. 17 of them. 9 years of work. 9 years of ideas that nobody had ever seen. Solutions that nobody had ever asked for. Brilliance that nobody had ever acknowledged. Until a little girl in a faded blue dress pointed at him and said 4 words. My daddy designed that engine. Daniel closed the notebook, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. For the first time in weeks, he slept through the night. Sunday came the way all days come, that carry the weight of a man's entire life. Quiet. Ordinary. The alarm went off at 4:30, and Daniel killed it before the second ring. He lay there for 10 seconds. Same as always. Then his feet hit the floor. But this morning was different. He didn't go to the kitchen first. He went to Emma's room. He pushed her door open and stood there, watching her sleep. She was on her back, one arm draped over the stuffed rabbit, mouth slightly open, breathing slow and easy. She had no idea what today meant. She had no idea that in 6 hours, her father was going to stand in front of the most important people in the industry and bet everything on an engine he'd built in the dark. We're going to be okay, baby girl, he whispered. Whatever happens today, we're going to be okay. He closed her door and went to the kitchen. He didn't make her sandwich yet. He poured a cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and called Mrs. Kessler. Dorothy, I need a favor. Can you bring Emma to the factory at 2 o'clock? The demonstration starts at 3, but I want her there early. Of course, dear. Is she going to watch? She's going to sit in the front row. Daniel, are you sure? There'll be a lot of important people there. What if she gets nervous? Daniel smiled. Dorothy, that kid walked into a room full of 40 engineers and told the CEO of a $2 billion company that her daddy designed the engine. She doesn't get nervous. I get nervous. She just tells the truth. Mrs. Kessler laughed. Fair enough. We'll be there at 2. He hung up, drank his coffee, and got dressed. Not the coveralls. Not the suit either. Victoria had told him to wear whatever felt right. He put on clean dark pants, a white button-down shirt, and his best boots. He looked in the mirror. He looked like himself. That was the point. He drove to the factory and arrived at 6. The demonstration wasn't until 3, but Daniel needed to run final checks.
Every bolt, every seal, every sensor.
He wasn't going to leave a single thing to chance. Greg was already there when he walked in. So was Lisa. And Thomas Ridley, standing in front of the Helion X with a diagnostic tablet in his hand, running through the checklist Daniel had written. "You're early," Daniel said. Thomas didn't look up. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd be more useful here than staring at my ceiling." "Everything looking good?" "Every parameter is within spec. Fuel system is solid. Cooling system is nominal. The new fuel rail is holding perfectly. No pressure anomalies." Daniel walked to the engine and put his hand on it. He could feel the metal under his palm, cool and smooth. He'd touched this engine 1,000 times, but today it felt different. Today it felt like something alive, something waiting. "We're ready," Thomas said. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "We are." The morning passed in a blur of final preparations.
The demonstration hall on the first floor had been converted into a presentation space. A raised platform held the Helion X at the center. Monitoring screens surrounded it, ready to display real-time performance data. Rows of chairs faced the platform, enough for 70 people. The board of directors would sit in the front row, along with investors, media, and senior leadership. By noon, the team had run through the demonstration sequence 3 times. Engine start. Idle calibration. Gradual load increase to 50%. Full load at 100%. Sustained operation for 10 minutes. Controlled shutdown. Each phase would display corresponding data on the screens. Fuel efficiency, emission levels, temperature, vibration, noise. Daniel had memorized every number, every threshold, every possible deviation. If something went wrong, he'd know within seconds. At 1:30, people started arriving. Daniel watched from the lab as black cars pulled into the parking lot. Men and women in expensive clothes walking toward the entrance. Camera crews from 2 tech publications setting up in the back. Richard Carr arrived in a town car, flanked by his lawyer. He didn't look at anyone as he walked inside. At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Kessler's station wagon pulled up. Emma got out, wearing the same faded blue dress she'd been wearing the day she pointed at Daniel in front of Victoria and 40 engineers. Daniel didn't know if she'd chosen it on purpose or if it was just her favorite dress. Either way, it hit him right in the chest. He met her at the door. She looked up at him and grinned. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, baby." "Is that the engine in there?" "That's the engine." "Can I see it?" He took her hand and walked her to the demonstration hall. The Helion X sat on its platform, polished and gleaming under the lights. Emma stood in front of it and stared. "It's bigger than I thought," she said. "Yeah, it's pretty big." Does it really work? We're about to find out. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "It works, Daddy. I know it does." "How do you know?" "Because you built it, and you don't build things that don't work." He squeezed her hand. "Go sit with Mrs. Kessler. Front row, on the left. I saved you a seat." "Okay." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Daddy?" "Yeah?" "I'm proud of you, no matter what happens." He watched her walk to her seat, climb up, and fold her hands in her lap. 7 years old, and she was the calmest person in the building. At 2:45, Victoria found Daniel in the lab. She was wearing a dark blue suit, and she looked like a woman who had bet everything on a single hand and was ready to turn the cards over.
"How are you feeling?" she asked. "Terrified." "Good. Terrified means you care. Are we ready?" "The engine is ready. The team is ready." "Are you ready?" Daniel took a breath. "Yes, ma'am."
Victoria put her hand on his arm. "Daniel, I want you to know something. Regardless of what happens in there today, I don't regret a single decision I've made about this project. Putting you in charge was the best call I've made in 14 years. Whatever happens next, that doesn't change."
"Thank you, Victoria. Now let's go make history." At 3 o'clock sharp, Daniel walked onto the platform. 70 people sat in front of him. Board members, investors, engineers, media. In the front row, Richard Carr sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set. 2 seats away from him, Margaret Chen sat with a legal pad on her knee. And on the far left, Emma sat between Mrs. Kessler and Greg Mercer, her feet dangling 6 inches off the floor because the chair was too big for her. Daniel stood next to the Helion X and looked out at the room. His team stood behind him.
Thomas Ridley on his left, Lisa Fan on his right. Greg Mercer in the front row, ready to handle the data displays. James Whitford and Sarah Kim at the monitoring stations. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. "My name is Daniel Hayes. 9 months ago, I was a mechanic in this building. I fixed machines. I replaced parts. I worked the early shift so I could pick my daughter up from school at 3:15. And every night, after she fell asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and designed engines that nobody ever asked me to design." He paused. The room was completely still. 6 months ago, I walked into the prototype lab in the middle of the night and rebuilt this engine from the ground up. I didn't have authorization. I didn't have a degree. I had 17 notebooks full of ideas and a daughter who believed I could do something extraordinary. Today, I'm going to show you what I built. Not because I need your approval, because this engine deserves to be seen. He turned to Thomas. "Start her up." Thomas pressed the ignition sequence on the control panel. The Helion X turned over once, twice. On the 3rd rotation, the engine caught and roared to life. The sound filled the room. Not a rough, grinding roar like the old engines, something smoother, deeper. A sound that vibrated in the chest and told you that every component inside was working in perfect harmony. The data screens lit up. Idle RPM, 800. Fuel consumption, optimal. Temperature, stable. Emissions, 41% below industry standard. Daniel watched the numbers and felt his heart pounding. So far, so good. "Increasing load to 50%, Thomas announced. The engine's pitch changed. Deeper, more powerful. The monitoring screens updated in real time. Fuel efficiency held steady. Temperature rose within projected parameters. Vibration levels were so low that James Whitford actually double-checked his instruments. 50% load. "All parameters nominal," Thomas reported. Daniel looked at the audience. Richard Carr was leaning forward now, his arms no longer crossed. Margaret Chen was writing on her legal pad. Several investors were whispering to each other. "Take her to full load," Daniel said. Thomas increased the output to 100%. The Helion X responded like it had been waiting for this moment its entire existence. The sound deepened into a steady, thunderous hum. The kind of sound that power makes when it's perfectly controlled. The numbers on the screen were staggering. Fuel efficiency, 27.4% above the company's best existing engine. Emissions, 43% below standard. Thermal efficiency, 53.2%. Temperature stability within 1.5 degrees of projection. Lisa Fan stared at her screen and shook her head slowly. Not in disbelief, in awe. "Sustained operation commencing," Thomas said. 10-minute clock starts
Now.
10 minutes. The engine had to run at full load for 10 continuous minutes without any deviation in performance. That was the test. That was the moment of truth. Daniel stood next to the engine and watched the clock. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. The numbers held. Every single parameter stayed within spec. The Helion X ran like a heartbeat. Steady. Relentless. Perfect. At the 5-minute mark, Daniel looked at Emma. She was sitting on the edge of her chair, watching the engine with wide eyes. She wasn't watching the screens. She wasn't watching the investors. She was watching the engine. And she was smiling. The same smile she had when she watched Daniel draw at the kitchen table. The smile that said, "I knew you could do it." 6 minutes. 7. 8. At 9 minutes, something happened. A slight fluctuation on the temperature gauge. 1/2 degree above projection. Daniel's eyes locked on the screen. His heart rate spiked. Lisa noticed it too. "Temperature anomaly," she said quietly, so only the team could hear. 0.5 degrees above expected range. Daniel's mind raced. 1/2 degree wasn't dangerous. It wasn't even outside tolerance. But it was unexpected. And unexpected in front of 70 people and a hostile investor was the last thing he needed. He ran the calculations in his head. The ambient temperature in the hall was 2 degrees warmer than the lab where they'd run previous tests. 70 bodies in a room generate heat. The engine was compensating, but the cooling system was calibrated to lab conditions. "It's environmental," Daniel said. "Ambient temperature differential. It'll stabilize." Lisa watched the gauge. At 9 minutes and 20 seconds, the temperature leveled off. At 9 minutes and 40 seconds, it dropped back to within projection. "Stabilized," Lisa said. The relief in her voice was barely concealed. 10 minutes, Thomas announced. "Full load test complete. All parameters within specification." Daniel exhaled. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath. Initiate controlled shutdown. The engine wound down gradually, the sound fading from a roar to a hum to silence. The monitoring screens displayed the final results. Every number green, every benchmark exceeded. The room was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then the applause started. It began in the back, with the media crew. Then the middle rows joined in. Then the investors. Then the board members. Margaret Chen was clapping. Martin Cole was clapping. Even Richard Carr's lawyer was clapping, though Carr himself sat motionless, staring at the engine. Daniel didn't hear the applause. Not really. He heard something else. He heard Emma's voice cutting through the noise. "That's my daddy's engine!" She was standing on her chair, clapping with both hands above her head, and her voice carried across the room like it was the only sound in the world. People turned to look at her. Some of them laughed. Some of them wiped their eyes. Victoria Loron stood up from her seat and walked to the platform. She shook Daniel's hand, then turned to face the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed is not simply a technological breakthrough. It is a testament to what happens when talent is given the opportunity it deserves. Daniel Hayes built this engine in the dark, alone, because no one thought to ask a mechanic if he had ideas. That failure belongs to all of us. The success belongs to him." She turned to Daniel. "Mr. Hayes, on behalf of Loron Industrial Technologies, I am announcing the immediate production authorization of the Helion X engine, and I am appointing you as Vice President of Advanced Engine Development, effective today." Daniel stared at her. Vice President. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Victoria smiled. "You can say something, Daniel." He looked at his team. Greg, who had believed in him when no one else did. Lisa,
who had caught the exhaust valve improvement that made the engine even better. Thomas, who had fought him every step of the way, and then turned around and gave him everything he had. James and Sarah and every person who had stayed late, worked weekends, and poured their talent into this project because Daniel had convinced them it was worth it. Then he looked at Emma. She was still standing on her chair, grinning so wide it looked like her face might split in half. "I don't have a speech," Daniel said. "I'm not good at speeches. But I'll say this. 9 years ago, I walked into this building believing my best days were behind me. I thought the best I could hope for was to keep my head down, do my job, and make sure my daughter had a roof over her head. I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong is standing right there in the front row in a faded blue dress." Every head turned to Emma. My daughter saw something in me that I'd stopped seeing in myself. She watched me work at that kitchen table every night, and she never once told me to stop. She never once said it was a waste of time. She just believed, quietly, completely. And when the moment came, she stood up and told the truth. That's all she did. She told the truth, and it changed everything. He stopped. He could feel the emotion rising in his throat, and he wasn't going to let it take over. Not yet. "I want to thank Victoria Loron for having the courage to bet on a mechanic. I want to thank my team for turning a prototype into a production engine. And I want to thank my daughter for being the bravest person I've ever known." He stepped off the platform. Emma ran to him, and he scooped her up and held her against his chest. She wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm proud of you, Em. I've always been proud of you." The crowd was standing now, all of them. Even Richard Carr was on his feet, though his expression was unreadable. He stood there for a long moment, then walked to the platform. The room went quiet, watching. Carr stopped in front of Daniel. He looked at him. Then he looked at Emma, still in her father's arms. "Mr. Hayes," Carr said, "I came here today expecting to prove that this project was a mistake. I was wrong. The engine speaks for itself. And so do you." He extended his hand. Daniel shifted Emma to one arm and shook it. "I'll be increasing my investment," Carr said, "substantially." He walked away without another word. Victoria caught Daniel's eye from across the room and nodded once. A small nod, but it said everything. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. Investors lined up to speak with Daniel. Media wanted interviews. Board members wanted handshakes. Through all of it, Emma stayed by his side, holding his hand or sitting on his hip, watching everything with the quiet amazement of a child who was watching her father open a bottle of champagne someone had brought, and they passed it around. Thomas Ridley took a sip and handed it to Daniel. "Not bad for a mechanic," Thomas said. "Not bad for a team," Daniel replied. They clinked cups. Paper cups, because nobody had thought to bring glasses. It didn't matter. It was the best champagne Daniel had ever tasted. Victoria came to find him before he left. "Daniel, there's something else. I've spoken with the board, and we're establishing a new program, the Hayes Initiative. It's a company-wide development fund for employees at every level to submit ideas, pursue education, and advance, regardless of their current position. No one in this building will ever be invisible again. Not if I can help it." Daniel felt the words land in his chest. "You're naming it after me?" "I'm naming it after the man who proved it was necessary." He didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing he could. "Thank you, Victoria." He drove home that night with Emma asleep in the back seat, her head resting against the window, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The streets were quiet. The streetlights painted yellow stripes across the dashboard. Daniel drove slowly, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to hold on to this feeling for as long as he could. He carried Emma inside and put her to bed. He pulled the blanket up to her chin and sat on the edge of the mattress, looking at her. This girl, this small, fearless, impossible girl. She had walked into a room full of grown men and women and changed his life with 4 words. "My daddy designed that engine." She hadn't known what those words would do. She hadn't calculated the impact or weighed the consequences. She'd just told the truth, because that's what children do when no one has taught them to be afraid of it yet. Daniel leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Emma," he whispered, "for seeing me when nobody else did." He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and sat down at the table. The stack of 17 notebooks was still there. He opened the first one, the oldest one, and flipped through the pages. Years of work. Years of ideas scrawled in pencil at 2 a.m. Fuel systems, cooling mechanisms, exhaust routing, intake manifolds. Thousands of calculations, hundreds of designs, all created by a man who had every reason to give up, and never did. He closed the notebook and set it on top of the stack. Then he pulled a fresh one from the drawer, opened it to the first page, and picked up his pencil. There were more engines to build. He thought about what Victoria had said. "No one in this building will ever be invisible again." He thought about Thomas Ridley, who had spent 20 years believing that credentials were everything, and who had learned, in the space of 6 weeks, that the most qualified person in the room was the one who'd been fixing the stamping press. He thought about Greg, who had asked for help 6 months ago and had been told it was above Daniel's pay grade. He thought about Lisa and James and Sarah Kim and every person on that team who had brought their best because someone had finally asked them to. And he thought about Emma. Always Emma. She would grow up knowing that her father built an engine that changed an industry. She would grow up knowing that the world tried to keep him invisible, and he refused. She would grow up knowing that a man in coveralls, with grease under his fingernails and a box of notebooks under his bed, stood up in front of the most powerful people in the room and proved that talent has no title. But more than any of that, she would grow up knowing one thing that mattered more than all the rest. She would grow up knowing that she was the reason he found the courage to try. Daniel set the pencil down, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to his bedroom. He stopped at Emma's door one last time and listened. Soft breathing, steady, deep in a dream. He smiled. Then Daniel Hayes, the mechanic who designed an engine that changed the world, closed his eyes and slept the sleep of a man who had finally, after 9 long years, been seen. And that was enough. That was everything.